I'm really delighted, not only that you are all here, but also that our keynote is here. So I'm delighted to introduce Leslie Morris. So Leslie is the Beverly and Richard Fink Professor of Liberal Arts and Professor and Chair of the Department of German, Nordic, Slavic and Dutch at the University of Minnesota. Also at Minnesota, she has been the founding director of the Center for Jewish Studies. She has written widely on the poetics of post-Holocaust memory, German Jewish writing, experimental poetry, and also on translation. Probably most of you are aware of her most recent publication, The Translated Jew, German Jewish Culture Outside the Margins, which was published in 2018. Leslie is currently writing a hybrid experimental memoir entitled She Did Not Speak. And I think this is so exciting. I want to hear more about it because an excerpt from the book has been adapted by the experimental composer Isaac Roth Bloomfield for a large orchestral piece. So it would be wonderful to hear more about it. Anyway, no one better than Leslie to start us off today. Very welcome you are.
Well, first I want to thank Godela, Maria Roca, and Lizzie for the wonderful invitation. I truly am honored to be here and very excited to hear the conversation that already began with your also really wonderful introduction of the questions that we'll be looking at today. So I hope my comments, I've written them, intended to serve as a point of departure for today's conversation that will continue over the next several days about the relationship between German Jewish and post-migrant cultures. So I'm going to be beginning with some larger, broader questions about race, Jewishness, migration, multilingualism, and then move to a discussion of Tomer Gardi's broken German hinted at in my title. Perhaps a little wildly, I love that slip, thank you, at times. So I hope you'll all stay with me. All right. Several months ago, while hosting a group of German graduate students for a conference at the University of Minnesota, the final event after a year-long research seminar I team taught with colleagues at Minnesota, Berkeley, and Bochum on the archive, we took our German visitors to the memorial sites in progress at George Floyd Square in Minneapolis, and then to a new archival exhibition devoted to preserving the memory of the African-American community in St. Paul that had been decimated by the construction of the interstate in the 1950s. While speaking at the exhibit with a community activist about the destruction of the St. Paul African-American community, the German grad students expressed surprise and discomfort at being seen and understood as being white, with the various privileges that whiteness entails, as they, despite not being Americans, were interpolated into white America with its attendant racism. As Germans, they were quick to point fingers at American racism, but reluctant to probe the historical underpinnings of race and privilege in German culture, and even more so to understand the repression of those memories of historical violence in Germany. To be German for them was not to be white. The concept simply did not translate. This anecdote suggests precisely the sort of political racelessness in contemporary Germany that David Theo Goldberg has identified. While Goldberg, Rita Chin, Fatima Al-Tayeb, and others locate one source for this racelessness as amnesia against the ever-present memory of the Nazi genocide of the Jews, with its attendant racializing structure of Jew versus Aryan, it seems my German students' discomfort with being labeled white is both more simple and yet more complicated than this. El-Tayeb defines political racelessness not as the absence of racial thinking, but rather, in her words, as a form of racialization that can be defined as specifically European, both in its informed silence and in allowing to forever consider the race question as eternally and by implication temporarily imposed. End of the quote. I want to also raise the question, parenthetically, of whether Al-Tayyeb's focus on racialization only serves to re-racialize or re-migrantize a migrant population that is in fact becoming increasingly absorbed into the mainstream. And I'm sure we'll return to that question. And yet, to return to the German graduate students' response to being seen as white, the difficulty, in fact, the impossibility of translating these terms between English and German is seen by Al-Tayyeb's own translation of her work on racelessness into German, illustrating how terms in English that function as concepts, race, racelessness, racialized, must be explicitly explained when rendered into German. So terms, the question of Rassenlosigkeit or Rassismuslosigkeit, or even more frequently seen now, Rassifizierung or a rassifizierte Person or Racialisierung. The presence in German of terms such as BIPOC, Black Lives Matter, and so forth from the discourse on race in the US perhaps also reinforces my students' belief that it is America and not Germany that has the race problem. Yasmin Yildiz notes in her recent article on reading racialization that, and I'm quoting here, the public injunction to delegitimize any public discourse about race after National Socialism is a function of not only the silence that El-Tayyeb identifies, but also of the amnesia about race. As she says, an active, repeated forgetting, this amnesia frames both the presence of minorities across European history and their experiences of racism as an unexpected novelty, eternally encountered, as if for the first time. End of quote. As Yildiz, Chin, and others have noted, this amnesia and this active, repeated forgetting in Germany has its roots in the post-war German anxiety about any return to racialized discourse after the Nazi genocide. The current discourse on German colonialism and genocide in the early 20th century only highlights the unresolved and repressed racism that is part of the many memorialization projects in Germany that have at their core the belief that they have overcome racism. And just as a side point, I want to mention Priya Basel, who captures this thought so beautifully in her video essay, Locked in and Out, about the Humboldt Forum, as she shows how the continuities of colonialism are as much a part of the memorialization, musealization, and the struggles for racialized minorities to belong to German culture. I take this then as my point of entry to explore the affective and textual links and resonances between the legacies of anti-Semitic violence, German Jewish culture, and what we might understand as post-migrant cultures. I will be drawing later in this talk on Tomer Gardi's 2016 novel, Broken German, to explore this entanglement of German Jewish and migrant cultures that the conference organizers invite us to examine. How do works by racialized and migrantized others in the German-speaking world help expand our understanding of German Jewish culture? I want to start the conversation that I anticipate will be a lively one over the next few days by posing the question of the place of Jews and Jewish cultural production in the migration turn, if we want to call it that, in German cultural studies, in light of current debates about race, racelessness, whiteness, and ethnicity. What are the political implications of asserting an ongoing role for Jewish culture within or alongside the debates about post-migrant culture? How can we rethink and reimagine the borders between German Jewish and post-migrant cultures to account for the complex histories of migration, colonialism, and imperialism in the long aftermath of the Nazi genocide of the Jews? Can a discourse of post-migration include Jews, including those who immigrated to Germany from the former Soviet Union? Or does the term post-migrant erase, displace, or obscure the place of Jews in a post-migrant Germany? And yet, of course, even these very terms are contested. Elie Geisen, among others, has challenged the very notion of the term post-migrant as being celebratory, as it suggests a liberation from the state of being a migrant. Instead, Geisen urges us to think of it as a conceptual framework, as a Kampfbegriff or a Haltung. to which I would add as a signifier that is of necessity always in flux and is indeterminate. Dennis Utlu insists, similarly, on moving away from identitarian models of labeling artists and their work, labels which then constantly remigrantize these authors, and instead urges us to think about whose migrancy is included and referred to. Are we now at a post-migration moment in which migrants traumatized by war, dictatorship, and mass violence in their countries of origin are then re-traumatized by their experiences of xenophobia, for instance, in Germany? And does migration need to be coupled with trauma? What happens if we decouple migration from trauma? To Utlu's plea for greater specificity about the category of the post-migrant, I want to say a few words about the clunky and cacophonous term in German, Migrationshintergrund, that has always troubled me. It's perhaps the least poetic word in the German language. That might be one source of it. But it's a euphemistic and bureaucratic neologism coined by statisticians, an officialese language that masks the genealogies that make up family histories of migration, and even more so, the specificity of these histories and the complexity of ethnic movements in Europe. What I've long found interesting is that the term migration background has been largely uncontested in the German public sphere and among scholars of German studies. As an official category that became a statistical term for describing populations in official records starting in 2007, when the German Federal Statistical Office began publishing data on people with a migration background, the term Migrationshintergrund creates a new taxonomy of the population in Germany. And in doing this, it is tightly bound, of course, to issues of citizenship and older ethnic categories, but excludes former GDR citizens and people who immigrated to Germany soon after World War II, not to mention Jews, including the post-Wende rapid increase in the Jewish population due to migration from Russia. In short, as the Berlin-based ethnologist Anna-Kathrin Will notes, and I'm quoting, the label migration background is misleading because inherited citizenship and ancestry is in the center of the definition rather than migration experience, end of quote. And this might be the real source of my discomfort with the term. In a German that embodies the clumsy idiom of the state apparatus, it both elides and replicates the particular history of linguistic formulations of otherness that found their fullest expression in National Socialism. These challenges to any easy notion of the post-migrant are consonant with my own approach to German Jewish culture. In The Translated Jew, I tried to open up the frame of what we understand as Jewish and as German Jewish text to explore writers, not all of whom would be understood or even understand themselves to be halachically Jewish or even German, who embrace Hélène Cixous's notion of the polylingualism of one's own language. As Cixous, for me, the emblematic translated German Jew, Juif, reminds us again and again, and I quote, a language always speaks several languages at once and runs with a single word in opposite directions. In highlighting the role of multilingualism in opening up new spaces to think about the vicissitudes of Jewish culture, I also attempted to deterritorialize Jewishness and complicate the relationship between language, place, and meaning in order to expand and translate and not police the borders of what we might understand as Jewish culture and writing. By focusing on the continual accrual and dispersion of meaning that exceeds the reference German and Jewish, my hope was to productively deterritorialize the object of study, the text, the work of art, the cultural artifact, as well as the very notion of Jewishness, and to unmoor Jewishness from genealogy, history, memory, instead seeing it perhaps as a hopelessly utopian textualized space of possibility. One question that is particularly germane to the task of thinking about the relationship between post-migrant and German Jewish cultures is what it might mean to move past a paradigm of boundedness in thinking about the relationship of Jews to other cultures, and instead to think of a klezmerical relationship between Jews and other others, one that is characterized by fluidity, hybridity, and a constant re-interrogation of the very terms that constitute its otherness. In other words, to create a klezmerical relationship is to think of new ways of creating alliances and not of policing borders of identity and affiliation. Drawing on Jonathan Friedman's term klezmerical, which he uses to describe American Jews, and I'm quoting here, syncretic, hybridizing engagement with a national culture in ways that transform both their own identity and experience and that of the culture at large, end of quote. I argue that the klezmerical, unbounded and translated into the broadest possible range of cultural contexts, gives rise to generative paradigms of entanglement between Jewish and German, and thus new ways of thinking about cultural memory, public art, digital media, and urban spaces. Where might the concept of the post-migrant fit then into the klezmerical? Perhaps as a way to break out of static paradigms of conceptualizing migrancy and to be and even embrace being simultaneously at home and out of place. In other words, I've tried both in my book and in other publications to dismantle a hegemonic unitary understanding of Jewishness and German Jewish culture, and instead to think about how the complex mechanisms of translation, multilingualism, and race are always at play in producing this very Jewishness. Accompanying this is my insistence on the impossibility of an untranslated, untranslatable, or authentic Jewishness. In other words, Jewishness, like Germanness, is hardly a given or authentic object of inquiry, but instead something that is formed through various acts of translation, transmission, entanglement, and movement, and that develops new, poetically cacophonous, I suppose, and asemic models beyond simple binaries of inside, outside, center, periphery, foreground, background, canon, avant-garde, and to that I want to add perhaps Jewish and post-migrant. So to the question of Jewishness and the post-migrant, we need to find ways to retain multi-directionally the place of Jewishness in the project of uncovering multiple traumatic and violent histories. Yet at the same time, I want to urge us not to place Jewishness as the privileged or sole lens through which to explore these legacies of historical violence, but also not to elide it. The title of my talk, Broken Jewish, is not only a play and the title of Tomer Gardy's novel, but also an attempt to create or to break into new affiliations of belonging and identity between Jews and other others in Germany. In many of the contemporary debates about race, the Jew occupies an awkward place of discomfort. It is omitted, glossed over, elided, but at the same time becomes merged into a broader universalist conversation about human rights that then elides and renders invisible the particular Jewish context. I mention this despite my own discomfort about the implications of the issues that I raise and my sense that there is no easy answer or solution to offer. But I want to mention some recent work that attempts, although in ways that also make me a bit uneasy, that attempts to counter this elision. The recent work of young Jewish scholars in Germany, such as Ina Holev and Miriam Yosef, whose manifesto calling for a new Jewish futurism that is intersectional and yet still places Jews and Jewishness at the center, argues that German majority culture oscillates between the desire for historical amnesia on the one hand and what they term a self-centered culture of memory, thus not leaving any space for living, breathing Jews, they claim. Holev and Yosef echo Afrofuturism's call for a recentering and reclaiming of Black culture in the aftermath of slavery, yet with Jews at the center. And I want to ask, and maybe we can return to this, I don't know where or how they then place Afrofuturism or Jewish futurism vis-a-vis Afro-pessimism. And I wonder then, would a Jewish pessimism serve to counter Salo Baron's critique of the lachrymose conception of Jewish history? I'm really not sure any of this works, quite frankly. Similarly, Vivian Laumann and Judith Coffey's book on Goy normativity aims to destabilize the terms German and Jewish and to create greater Jewish visibility by naming the forever unmarked Goy. Laumann and Coffey argue that the parallel of Goy with the Romani term Gadya, to refer to the non-Roma, opens the potential for solidarity between Jews and the Roma community. Both of these projects grow out of and are symptomatic, I think, of the fear of the erasure of Jewishness in the larger debates about race, nation, and indigeneity, and the desire to open the current debates to include Jews. I have to say, though, that I am skeptical, but my skepticism is not that I do not share this deep desire to insert or reinsert the category of Jew into the discourse on race and racelessness in Germany in order to forge a new place of belonging for German Jews, especially at this moment of renewed and virulent anti-Semitism. In part, my discomfort is that both Goy normativity and Jewish futurism rely on and indeed celebrate the trope of the Jew as the forever radical, queer, off-center, nomadic outsider, failing to account for the very real issues of power and privilege that attend the social and global position of Jews. And yet it also seems to me that despite the renewed attention in the past several years to racialized and traumatic histories, the category of Jew has gradually become erased in the field of German studies, perhaps in literary studies and the humanities more generally. Indeed, scholars have opened up the question of migration and memory to include multiple groups on the margins and have taken up Rothberg's invitation to consider the multiple and multi-directional historical layers of the Nazi genocide of the Jews. Yet what happens to the category of Jew, even as scholars acknowledge that the Nazi genocide has been foundational for much of the work on memory, trauma, and its aftermath in our field? To conceptualize moving beyond the Holocaust, which was the title of a recent GSA panel, and beyond Jews and Jewishness in Germany, is to set up precisely the sort of zero sum that Rothberg has been so adept at helping us move beyond. What does it mean to move beyond the Holocaust in order to recognize and give voice to other marginalized and traumatized groups? How can we both retain the centrality of Jewishness to German culture while also opening up spaces for others and read these histories in concert with each other to explore how gender, sexual violence, linguicide, racialization, and so forth arguably remain under-discussed and unmemorialized in Holocaust and German studies? Can the discourse on the post-migrant help to expose the erasures and shed light on the presence of the specter of Jewishness? This, it seems to me, is not only the task of those of us gathered at this conference for the next several days, but also, I would hope, for those in our field more broadly. One place to start, it seems to me, is to embrace plurilingualism, to forge links between German Jewish and post-migrant cultures that might help to challenge rigid orthodoxies of belonging, highlighting the insufficiency of any one given native, so-called native tongue, and the impossibility of any national or ethnic designation. This certainly seemed to be the project of Kanakatak in the early 2000s, which El Tayeb notes was among the first cultural groups to champion a sort of inauthenticity. Rather than claiming a legible sort of positionality, they instead, and I'm quoting here from El Tayeb, continuously attacked and undermined the notion of authentic belonging itself. El Tayeb also suggests a return to the concept of diaspora as a productive way to open up a space for moving past the migration and with that post-migration debates, as diaspora enables a breaking down of the binary of citizen foreigner, origin, destination. Certainly, literary models of diaspora have enabled multi-directional readings of texts that join rather than separate the experience of certain ethnic, religious, and national groups. And Zenocek, I just want to point yet again to the work of Zenocek, who is perhaps the writer who has consistently weaved together histories of Jews and Turks in his work. Positing the idea of a post-ethnic minoritarian identity, El-Tayeb champions a tradition of radical, post-national, post-ethnic cultural activism, citing minority youth culture as creating precisely the space, and here I'm quoting again, for a localized, multi-centered, horizontal community that is urban in ethos and spirit, transcending ethnic and national limits, and is combined with a larger diasporic perspective, end of quote. Strikingly absent, however, from this is any acknowledgement of the historic role Jews have played in similar projects or the parallels to contemporary Jewish cultural circles. In many regards, El-Tayeb's plea for this porous space of true cultural exchange, a localized, multi-centered, horizontal community, marks the younger generation of Jews in Germany who are calling for precisely this kind of radical openness and space of hybrid exchange. Max Cholek, for instance, curated a show as part of the Tage der jüdisch-muslimischen Leitkultur at the Gorki Theater in 2020, where Daniel Kahn first performed The Jew in You, a rambling performance poem addressing, I'm quoting from Kahn, you lost exilic aliens, you migrant mongrel stew, and putting forth a vision for a diasporic politics with permeable borders that makes a case for an indeterminate Jewishness that has everything to do with migrant and other cultures. Kahn writes, I'm just going to cite a few lines from his very long poem. Well, the Jewishness concerning us should not be misconstrued. Blood and land are things with which it doesn't have to do. Religion is a matter most irrelevant here too. So let's try to look at this anew, to find a category underneath the ones we knew, a mercurial identity for people who are strewn in countries far and wide, who haven't got a home in view, who drag around like shackles all the roots from which they grew. So I talk about the inner other hiding inside you. This name I give this other is a Jew, but a Jew could be an Arab or a German or a Druze, the imaginary messianic diasporic youth, the broken and neurotic post-apocalyptic you, and it goes on from there. The broken, rhizomatic, unbounded, and intensely vibrant Jewishness that is at the heart of Kahn's invocation to the imaginary messianic diasporic youth, the broken and neurotic post-apocalyptic you, is also the very center of the 2016 novel by Israeli author Tomer Gardi, Broken German. Written in what has been described as a broken or a pidgin German, that doesn't really work as with the German, the term pidgin, that destabilizes language as it reenacts migration and movement, both Jews and other migrants, across the surfaces of the text. The novel exposes the fault lines between language, migration, authorship, multilingualism, and memory. So I've actually done a very low tech. I didn't want to do a PowerPoint. Instead, you have handouts because it will be nearly impossible for me to read out loud. One has to visually see it, I believe. And I also made the decision, others have actually translated into correct idiomatic English when they have cited him. And I chose not to do that as well. I think it's nearly impossible to translate Gardi's work. And I also think if it were ever to appear in English translation, it would raise possibly disturbing questions for American readers. So for instance, it's really hard to imagine a contemporary novel by a white author in English that would ventriloquize the so-called broken English of minority communities. So while it has been described by some critics as a sociolect that reflects the reality of non-native German speakers, I prefer to think of this as a sort of para-German, a German that is beside or next to or near to the German, which is one meaning of the prefix para, but also contains the other meaning of para, against or contrary to. Most importantly, Gardy's novel creates what Wiebke Sievers has called in her essay entitled From Monolingualism to Multilingualism, a new global literary German, as it weaves together German Jewish history and migration history, insisting that these histories can only be told multilingually and between the languages of both the perpetrators and victims. And yet, despite the fact that the novel is set in Berlin, the hegemonic cultural center is also part of what Gardy breaks with in this novel. Wiebke Sievers, who I also believe is here, so I'm very happy to meet her after this. So Wiebke Sievers, for instance, places the novel within an Austrian context, published, as she points out, by the Droschel Verlag in Graz after having been rejected by several German publishers, and first debuted in Klagenfurt when it was a finalist for the 2016 Bachmann Prize, which was the year that Sharon Dodua-Otto, another non-German native speaker, won the prize. Broken German points to the complex, indeed broken and ruptured cultural literary communities between Germany and Austria. And again, as Wiebke points out, importantly, Gardy lived in Vienna for several years in childhood, studied there, and also lived in Graz while writing Broken German. It points to this brokenness between Germany and Austria and its project of decentering and destabilizing German literary language. The para-German of Broken German trips and stumbles over itself, filled with inconsistent, but often quite humorous double entendre, lexical, orthographic, and grammatical errors that at first glance would seem to mimic the German spoken by migrants. And of course, we can and I think should talk about the political implications of an Israeli Jew writing in the patois of the migrant German speaker, caricatured in other books and films. As the narrator repeats in one vignette, Gewalt hinterlässt Spuren, violence leaves behind traces, thus linking the current and historical violence enacted against both migrants and Jews. Tamar Gardy's novel both enacts and critiques the brokenness of the German language, not only after Auschwitz, but after Hoyerswerda and even after Halle. While these pivotal locations of trauma and violence are not named in the novel, the sites of encounter in Berlin of Jews and migrants in Broken German, the airport parks, the Jewish museum, and most of all, the call shop, the English word is used in the novel to designate the shops where one could buy, once upon a time, phone cards and place calls abroad, use the internet, and so forth. These places are all, as Wiebke and others have all pointed out, places of transit, multilingualism, and transnational exchange. It is the fractured, ruptured, borderless, as Wiebke calls it, para-German, that places Gardy's text not only alongside political novels exploring the vicissitudes of migration, otherness, trauma, and relocation, but perhaps just as importantly, literary experimental texts. While critics have variously seen Gardy's novel as an important political intervention or as little more than a gimmick, I instead approach it as one among many contemporary experimental works that open up new spaces for the creation of multilingual and plurilingual poetics. So Wiebke also points out importantly that and places it in the tradition of the Austrian avant-garde of Jelinek and Ilse Eichinger, among others. But to that, I would want to add contemporary experimental transnational poets such as Uliane Wolf, Caroline Bergwall, Daniel Blaufuchs, Max Cholak, and there are certainly others. Not only is the language fractured, broken, at times barely legible, but Gardy also ruptures narrative conventions by switching the protagonist from Radili, a young Romanian Jewish immigrant introduced at the beginning of the novel, to a second, more autobiographical narrator. And I'm going to just skip ahead a little here in the interest of time. The complexity and uncertainty about how Jews are seen or how to grapple with Jewishness in light of questions of race and ethnicity in contemporary Germany. Indeed, the invisibility and illegibility of Jews due to the amnesia identified by Goldberg, El-Tayeb, and others surfaces too in a passage in which the narrator encounters a blonde man in a bar who tries to determine what his religion is, running through a number of possibilities: Muslim, Greek Orthodox, Hindu, Buddhist, Taoist, Coptic, Baha'i, Rastafarian. He goes on and on and on, without ever landing on the correct one, which is, of course, Jude. The narrator then muses on how the word and concept of Jude is so deeply repressed, so completely absent. And it's the first quote on the handout, in the middle of which we hear das Wort, der nur auf Deutsch so klingelt, again, in this very particular German. The refrain of Wie sagt man auf Deutsch, you'll see in that quote that Wie sagt man auf Deutsch comes up many times, that appears continuously throughout the novel, suggests the narrator is thinking in another language, and yet that language is never specified. It is also, ironically, one of the few grammatically and orthographically correct sentences in the entire book. It is also never quite clear what the narrator is struggling to say auf Deutsch. Instead, the constant repetition of Wie sagt man auf Deutsch drives home the impossibility of any wholeness or legibility of language, defamiliarizing the German that follows and suggesting instability of language. What Gardy later has one word in reference to Wort loss. So Wort loss has the extra S and becomes a sort of hybrid term between the English and the German, Wort loss. Suggesting this as a permanent condition of life. To speak in this novel is to be Wort loss, and to wonder how to say anything. The constant interruption of the narrative with Wie sagt man auf Deutsch sets up the entire novel as a broken response to the question of Wie sagt man auf Deutsch, with the answer being that in speaking or writing German, one speaks and writes the forever absent, repressed, broken signifier, Jude. The entire novel, starting with its title, is a meta-reflection in this way on multilingualism, migration, Germanness, and by extension, Jewishness. In one of the early vignettes, some drunken skinhead soccer fans challenge a group of 3 young migrant boys, asking what sort of German they're speaking. We are told that they are not speaking Aryan Deutsch, spelled I-E-N. It is also on the handout, the passage. And at the end of the passage, growing increasingly aggressive, one of them, at the end of the passage, renamed in broken German their Verfolger, the persecutor who also happens to be following them, says to his companions, Die drei wollen uns anscheinend verarschen. And I just want to refer briefly to an interesting reading of this passage by Franca Sinopoli, who reads both the use of the Aryan, A-R-I-E-N, Deutsch, and the broken substitution of verarschen instead of with the R missing, noting that, and she says, Aryan Deutsch could be a wordplay invoking both an aria, the operatic aria, thus Germany's self-image as a nation of high culture and civilization, or Aryan, the anti-Semitic Nazi ideal of a German people. And she also goes on to suggest that the missing R in the verb verarschen evokes the word Asche, and with it, the concentration camps. The panic as the 3 boys hide from the Germans, their Verfolger, causes a near complete disintegration of grammatical structure that is highlighted then in the later chapter entitled Wort loss. So that actually in that passage, even the Wie sagt man auf Deutsch is incorrect. Man is spelled with 2 N's. This passage is one among many in which the German slides, or rather careens, into an associative chain of signifiers, evoking the very lostness of German culture, but also the irretrievability of the genre of the novel itself. The borderlessness of the German means that this is a novel, and I'm quoting here again from Wiebke Sievers, that claims the language for its speakers worldwide. End of quote. And yet, despite this constant rumination on loss and the lostness of language, what is particularly refreshing about Gardy's project is that it never slips into nostalgia for either the Weimar inflected German Jewish past, nor for the German of high culture, despite its frequent allusions to Kafka And as others have, of course, noted, it's throughout the novel, Report to the Academy, figures throughout Dublin's Berliner Alexanderplatz and also Nabokov. And I would add to that Nabokov, who has become interpolated perhaps into German Jewish textual history through Sebald's Austerlitz. And yet, as Yael Almog has argued recently, Gardy is a writer, and I'm quoting here from Almog, who uses his privileged visibility in the German-speaking world to align with underprivileged minorities. And I think this is a point that we will, I hope, come back to later or throughout the conference to talk about. It's an important one. About his privileged, highly visible status of Israelis in Berlin. In any case, the question needs to be asked if the brokenness of the German and broken German is demeaning and patronizing, if it ventriloquizes, in other words, the language spoken by migrants, or if we want to see it as abrasions on the surface of the German language that instead forever alters, as I would also argue other experimental poetry texts do, if it forever alters the sound and meaning of German. In other words, after reading Tomer Gardy or hearing it, if one were to hear it out loud, what are the after effects, the afterlives of that on language and text going forward? Gardy's novel is filled with references not only to current debates in Germany, but is also a reflection on issues of cultural sovereignty and belonging. In one humorous passage, the narrator addresses dear members of the Academy, thus consciously styling himself as Rotpeter from Kafka's Report to the Academy, and tells the story of how he had wandered into the Jewish Museum of Berlin to find a place to sleep for the night. He poses the salient question, itself the topic of a 2013 installation in the Jewish Museum Berlin, the controversial Jew in a Box. He asks, when a Jew walks into the Jewish Museum, does he become part of the exhibition? In many respects, the narrator not only enters the Jewish Museum to find a place to sleep, but enters into well-trodden and tired discourse in Germany about memorialization, Jewishness, and belonging, and raising familiar questions such as, what does it mean to enter the museum as spectator, but at the same time as object? Do Jews and others belong in the German cultural landscape only to the extent that they can be reduced as objects to be described, to be viewed with detachment according to the label assigned to them, as with objects in a museum? And is it only in a museum that Jewishness is a given or authentic object of inquiry? Those are some of the questions that are certainly have been circulating. Not my questions, but they're there. In bringing his narrator into the Jewish Museum to find a place to sleep, Gardy both raises and moves past these familiar questions, yet at the same time raising interesting ones about language. Whose language is broken German? Who gets to speak it or claim it as their own? The language of broken German is deceptively simple, and yet it's the entire novel is laced with multiple literary references as it plays on and with narrative strategies, beginning in the first pages. This is in the chapter entitled Wort Loss, with an extended reference to Nabokov's novel Pnin. The creation of Pnin as a figure in Gardy's novel is one of many auto-fictional devices that turn in on themselves, adding a new layer to the self-referentiality of a text that is both auto-fictional and that at the same time challenges the very project of autofiction. That Gardy affiliates himself with Nabokov, another writer who wrote in a language other than his native one, and Kafka is, of course, no surprise. The figures of Nabokov and Pnin are merged autofictionally as refugees, although Nabokov flees from Russia with his masterpiece English, that's Gardy, tight and precise, und matal glänzend, while his character Pnin flees from Russia to the US with his broken or shattered English, and the quotes from the passage are on the page as well. Creating the parallels between the migrations. Language for Gardy is simultaneously broken, shattered, and yet precise, shining like metal. And at the end of the novel, it is celebrated as a life force, as the Israeli narrator in dialogue with his mother, his Ima, finds himself once again in the call shop, listening to the hum of the different languages in the air, the soft whisper that sparks the following poetic meditation about language, sound, and belonging. And that's the final long quote on the handout that I won't read. These incantatory final lines of the novel are spellbinding, mesmerizing, and also utopian. As the narrator stands at the entrance to the call shop and listens, spellbound, to the sounds coming from the shop, he exults in both the sounds of the German language, producing alliteration and assonance, Geflüster, Fließ, Fels, Fließ, and so on, and associative wordplay. The languages he hears in the call shop stream, strömen, except without the umlaut, into his ear, with the streaming of language and its many echoes and chambers. And again, I'm grateful to Wiebke for pointing out, of course, the wordplay of the sound between Stromen and Strohmann, one among many wordplays. After the final, wie sagt man auf Deutsch, that final declaration of the very lostness of language, the Wort loss of the earlier chapter, the narrator affirms language as a life force that has the potential to renew itself. And look, if you look at the last line, und die Wörter leben, aufleben, beleben, in a German that is as broken and grammatically chaotic as the rest of the novel. To capture the reality and complexity of German culture, any attempt to say it merely auf Deutsch is to miss the mark, to attempt the impossible, as only a multi or plurilingual discourse, or at any rate, the hum of multiple languages, is adequate to contemporary Germany. The Berlin call shop, with the hum of languages all around, offers a tarnished utopia of Wort loss, where the future of a broken German, which is simultaneously a broken Jewish, can begin. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Maybe for the discussion, you could move over here because you're slightly off center.
Okay. Sure.
Right. Well, I'm sure there are lots of questions. There's one question that really sort of, I think, really went to the core of what we are trying to do here. And it's this question you raised about the core project, or the aim being to find a way of talking about Jewishness that doesn't privilege it, but also doesn't elide it. And I think that really is core in our thinking about the post-migrant as a concept that might help us do that. Now, you raised the question, so I'm not going to play it back to you, but I think it's something that we should all keep in mind and probably will come back to over the course of the conference. Instead, I just want to ask you a smaller question, really. So you were talking about the language used in Tomagadi's novel, and you quoted Wiebke Sievers in saying it's a new global literary German. And then you suggested another way of talking about it, and to call it the para-German. And I think that is very, very apt, because it seems to me that to call it any kind of a German is somehow off the point, because it is really about, I mean, he says at some point in his book, doesn't he, Sprache or German is ein öffentlicher Raum. So it's about being that room in which different trajectories reverberate to different, all these different possibilities. There's another word that I like. In a context where we would expect eigenartig, das eigenartige Deutsch, he says einartiges Deutsch.
Yeah.
So it's again this reference to everybody speaks their own German, and then it comes together in this öffentliche Raum. And so it's a very individual thing that makes something bigger in communication with others, doesn't it?
Yes, and I think that's what I like about thinking of it as para-German is also precisely that it touches on and that touching, that adjacency, being near to, and also coming up against. So both senses of para enables also that, I think that comes back and opens up that Raum at the end to something. It forces, I think, also reconceptualizing of space as well, perhaps. So I think it can be productive. So thank you for pointing that out. And I don't know if Wiebke is here. I saw her name on the program. Not yet. Oh, that's that's too bad. I look forward to meeting her. But anyway.
Great. Any other questions?
Thank you. That's a very interesting talk. I was just wondering, you sort of made a point towards the end about musealization. And I was just wondering, I sort of felt as though there might also be sort of the episode where the cleaning lady flees into the garden. This is sort of a point towards maybe like something like Dennis Kultur points out that there's a lack of an archive of migration. I don't know if you thought that was.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. Do you mean in the passage about the Jewish Museum as well?
The refugee.
Right. Yeah, I think that's absolutely, the case. I think questions of the archival here are interesting to think about on a number of levels. But again, I want to come back to the difficulty of how this is captured then in the German. I mean, there is a sense that I love this novel. I do read it. For me, it is, of course, it's experimental, but I very much want to read it alongside other instances of experimental visual poetry as well, because it is elusive in that way. And that question, I think, for how does one take into account both that elusiveness and the archival impulse, right, which is really quite contradictory. So that's an interesting question, though, I would think more about. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a question which, if you can answer, we can all sleep in when I give my talk, because I'm trying to grapple with some of the questions that you raised, not nearly as many. But what I'm particularly interested in is if you could, I'd just love to hear you talk more about the relation between the multilingual, the plurilingual, and the para-German, because it seems to me that this is a parallel question to the one that concerns the status of Jewishness vis-a-vis others. It's when I try and sort of fix on a way of describing what Gadi does with his German, and always it's somehow elusive, right? It's you either put it in relation to standard German, or you put it in relation to Hebrew, or you put it in relation to other migrant versions of either native languages or acquired languages like German, and then it just kind of disappears. And so I'd love to hear you speak more about these, or maybe also explain what you mean by all these different terms that you kind of offered as description.
Good. Well, thank you. And I'm glad you did. I actually had an aside I was going to address it and then decided to let it go. I would actually say one thing, though. I don't see it as, for me, it doesn't disappear. For me, it accrues, it proliferates, it creates, back to this idea of a textual space of possibility. That's what I find so deeply generative and exciting and really quite beautiful about this text. For me, it's just, I have a very strong emotional response to it, precisely not because of the disappearance, but rather the continued existence captured in those final lines, that very final line. But anyway, multilingual versus plurilingual. So for a long time, of course, it was the term multilingualism. So I intentionally kept both of those, in part to unsettle. I am myself unsettled somewhere between those. I want to come back to the wild, sort of what it is to write wildly. So it was in part a deliberate way to keep them open as questions, quite frankly. So Carolina Bergvall, who's an experimental poet whom I love very much, she's a mix of American, French, and Norwegian, has nothing to do really with German, except she has everything to do with German. So she is the one who, for me, has articulated a notion of the plurilingual. So it's just a vestige that I was, for a time, obsessed with her work, and so it found its way. But I think You know, of course, in terms of the meaning, multilingual, we understand what that means. For me, plurilingual opens up a somewhat more rhizomatic space, potentially rhizomatic space. Again, Sixu's notion of the, you know, that any single language contains all languages at once. So that multiplicity in space and time is there. I think it does suggest that more, but there are other ways in which I think multilingualism. So it was a choice I made. Other drafts of this, I actually chose one or the other. And in the end, I just decided I'm going to alternate or keep them both in. You know, it's also hard. I know, you know, I wrote this as a text, and roughly half of it is, of course, about a text that one cannot read out loud. The other thing I also just want to say that has nothing to do really with your question, but it's more broadly, you know, I wrote this in not only in the US, but in Minneapolis, as was clear from my opening reflections on questions of race. And then I've been here now for 24 hours, and I was thinking, my gosh, if I had written this in England or in London, it would have been a very different, talk, because as I'm, you know, living in a hotel around the corner from the British Museum and encountered with, you know, on a visual level, questions of British history and imperialism, one writes from where one actually is, of course. And so I was also very struck that what I read, and it's a written text, which is hard to hear, even just the vaught loss. I can't say that word. It's very difficult to say, right? Because I want to say vaught loss, but it isn't. And I can't say word loss. But at any rate, those kind of unsettling moments in what I wrote were, I was very aware of them. And the multilingualism, plurilingualism was another one. So I think it's, they're questions that I want to keep open for ongoing discussion here and beyond. So.
I suppose neither the multilingual nor the plurilingual quite captures it all, does it?
No,
I mean,
absolutely, yeah.
Largesse that is being opened out. And,
Yes.
Thank you so much. I have a, I don't know, I'm not clear for the clear my question. But I understood you talk also on the relation between culture and language, cultures and languages, and how they interconnected. So you also spoke about creating a space of possibilities, which I found was a nice formulation for detail. The language, I mean, uncoupling language from culture, right? And then throughout the whole talk, I was always thinking, so what then actually creates this space? Is it multiple languages, or plurality of cultures that are visible in language, experimental language? Or what is it? What would it be for you? What would it be for the
Yeah. That's interesting. So the one other thing I would add to what you just, in my idea of this, creating these textual spaces of possibility, it's also, I'm always have been interested in texts where sound and meaning are also just decoupled, where there's a rupture between the sound of the words. So experimental poetries that, in a sense, pull the rug out from our feet in that way. So I would say, so adding that then to your question, I'm, you know, interested, you know, primarily in thinking about working with, and myself also producing. I mean, I had forgotten, you know, that this new piece that I'm writing is in a very different mode. It's a hybrid experimental memoir. But it's in creating literary works that can open to something that startles and that's new, is what I would say. And that's, so I think, you know, sometimes they can be gimmicky. Some experimental poetry, you know, they latch onto a, you know, a thing, and it's the hot new thing, and everyone is, you know, sort of taken by it. But then I think the moments really of great beauty, which is actually how I would describe Tamar Gardy's novel, for me, has enormous beauty, because I think ultimately it is about potential. I find it a deeply moving text. And I describe it as utopian, although I refer to it as a broken and a tarnished utopian, but there is that he ends the novel as he does is really stunning, I think. So I would say it's those places where one is jolted out of the everyday, and made aware of language, not just in a way that defamiliarizes the language, but being aware of language in a way that can really do something new with language. And Migardi, he is one among many, but he does it, I think, in a way that's really beautiful. So.
Thank you so much. I think we should end on this very optimistic
Yes.
note. Thank you.